All right, so welcome to day one of our Sprang-Along, and today we are going to warp up to get ready for our sprung tomorrow. And I really like warping. It's kind of therapeutic, almost as much as I like working sprung, and I think sprung is very therapeutic too. So hopefully you enjoy the warping process as much as I do, and you'll have as much fun today. But before we can warp up, we need to work out what size we want our warp to be. Now there's three different ways this is going to go. Either you are a experienced crafter in sprung and you already have an idea of how to calculate what kind of size warp you need, in which case all you need to know is how we're going to be assembling the hat, and you can probably work it out from there. Or you are new to sprung, or you are not confident in your abilities to calculate what you need, in which case I'm going to be going over how I'm calculating my hat, and you can follow along with that. Or number three, and I do this sometimes, you might just throw caution to the wind and say, I'm just going to warp up something and I will make it work as a hat later. And I totally endorse that, because who wants to have to do math when they're crafting? I know it's not uncommon. Most crafting does require some kind of math, and sprung is no exception. But if you just want to make up a warp and go with it, that is cool, and I'm sure you can find a way to turn it into a hat later. The whole reason why I picked this pattern was because it was so forgiving. And that's actually how it happened in the beginning. The very first hat I made, which was actually this one here, it was just the pink, and it turned out way too wide and way too short. So I was like, hey, I'll add an all-minded brim, and it turned out really well. So if something about the sprung part of your hat is not a hat, your brim is there to save the day. So don't worry too much if the calculations are not quite right. Your brim will probably help pull out the whole project together and make it an actual wearable hat. So for those of you who are experienced and know how to do calculations, I'll show you how we're going to be working the sprung. So this is a warp I'm in the middle of working on. I'll give you the calculations, like how long and wide this is, but I mean, this is specific to my head. So it's the length of it is the length from where I would want the hat to sit on my forehead to the base of my neck, and then the width is half of the circumference of my head. Because what we're going to do is when we get to the middle of this, we're going to gather it up and tie it. We're not going to chain it, and then we're going to fold it in half, meeting the ends, and sew up the two sides. So that should be what you need if you are pretty confident on calculating how sprung is going to work up. If you are not, then in a minute we will go over the calculations as I go along. And I just want to quickly bring back the two hats, because you have a couple options here. This hat tends to be a little bit more of a slouchy hat, and hopefully I can put this on to make it look nice on the video. So this one's less of a beanie style and more of, you just kind of have that little extra poofy slouchiness in the back. And any of them can be made that way, but this one is a little bit wider than I might recommend. Whereas this one can be worn that same way. It's kind of a fun slouchy hat, or as a beanie. Kind of a funky looking beanie, but it is warm, which is nice. So part of the reason why this one works a little bit better as a beanie is because it's not quite as wide in the sprung, and also because I worked two threads as one to begin with to kind of match it to the brim, so that it didn't have this sort of gathered look to it. So those are the two hats that we're kind of basing our ideas off of as far as what style of hat you want. All right, so let's go ahead and move over to calculating our work. This is the worksheet that I put together, and it's just kind of my own thought process on how I go through calculating sprung, and you may already have your own process, or you may not, or you may take some of this and use it and do other things in other places. Whatever you want to do is great. I just wanted to show you how I came up with my calculations that created the hats that you've seen. That is what we're going to be making over the next 3 days. So you're going to need to get the circumference around your head and also the distance that you're going to want your hat to cover. So wherever on your forehead to the base of your neck. I like my hats to come down a little further because I really like to have my ears really, really well covered. Otherwise I get earaches. And then I'm just going to write on my little made up warp here what I want my dimensions to be. So I calculated my dimensions as my head circumference at 58 centimeters and my forehead to the base of my neck as 40 centimeters. So if we didn't make any changes to this, we would say that our warp needs to be 40 centimeters long, because that's the length from forehead to neck, and half of 58, 29 centimeters wide. And that's actually not what we're going to do, because we're going to take into account these little guidelines down here. So guideline number 1 is that sprung will shrink in length, just because of the way you're interlinking the threads, it's going to shrink. I generally use 12 to 15% for shrinkage. And so in this case, I'm going to multiply 40 by, I think I'm going to do 15% for this. And so that's going to be 6, and it's going to be 46 centimeters that I want my warp to be. However, I did another hat at 50 centimeters and it worked really well. So I think there's going to be more take up, and part of what the take up is can also be where it's gathered in the middle. So I think there's going to be extra take up because of this. So I don't think you would be remiss in going up to 20% on the take up, or just going ahead and using 50 centimeters like I did to warp up. So I'm going to go ahead and write 50 on the length of my warp, because I know that's going to work well, and still have a brim. Now if you wanted more of a brim, let me bring back that hat. So this was a 50 centimeter warp, and I only added 2 rows of null binding and a finish 2-2, and that was fine for a beanie that didn't have a turned up brim. If I wanted a turned up brim, I could have gone further, although I don't think I had enough yarn to do so. If I wanted this to be a bigger brim, I wouldn't make my sprung as long. And I don't have the hat with the knitted brim in front of me right now, but that's what I did with the hat with the knitted brim, is I made the whole warp a lot smaller and I made the brim even bigger. So it's up to you how big of a brim you want. I don't want a really big brim, I want more sprung to show, so I'm going to do that 50 centimeter length. So guideline number 2 is that sprang will generally open up in width once removed from the loom. But how much will really depend on the yarn and how you worked it. I don't know why, but acrylic always opens up a lot more than cotton or wool. I don't know why. I don't use acrylic very often. I almost always use cotton, and lately I've gotten into wool. So just know that the kind of yarn that you're using could change how much it opens up. So I generally assume that the sprung will grow in width, I don't know, about 1/3 the width of the warp. I don't usually turn that into any sort of percentage or decimal or anything. I just kind of eyeball it. But in this case, let's go ahead and assume 1/3 of the warp width and do that calculation. In order to calculate what 1/3 of my warp is, I'm going to multiply my circumference of 58 times 33.33%. And then that'll give me what 1/3 of my warp is, 19 centimeters. So now I have my warp dimensions of 50 centimeters long by 19 centimeters wide. And I already kind of talked about my guideline number 3, but really just have fun and don't worry too much about these dimensions. When in doubt, go a little bit longer on your warp and maybe a little bit narrower, but you would not be remiss to, you could just make your warp, the width of it, the half the width of your head circumference. And yeah, it's going to be way too big, but your brim will help fix that. Or if you are making something that you don't care about warmth as much, and you want to see the structure of the sprung with its pulled open, then go narrower. It's entirely up to what you want. And so you can use these guidelines, you can use this if you want, or you can just kind of take some dimensions off your head and make it work. So have fun with that, and then I will be doing a second video on warping up.